Okay, well, it's great to be able to talk to you. I hope the technology holds up. I'm in a hotel in Cornwall, about to do a couple of days training with a group of schools tomorrow. And even just last week, I was in a school in Bangkok, also talking about, I think they called it stretch and challenge, which is a kind of a frame that's often used. But I think this issue of inclusive teaching is challenging, and sometimes we sort of pick sides. And I wrote a blog recently, which was, can you pick, can you do a thing called teach to the top at the same time as being inclusive? And I think you can, but I think you have to think quite hard about that. I don't think it's easy, and I think you need to be quite intentional about it. So I got to talk a lot about the specifics of that, but also be mindful of the fact that you have to be referring to this framework for learning, the VTLM 2.0. And I think all these issues come up. You could do a mapping. I'm not going to do it with you now, but you could do a mapping of all of those things against the agenda for high attaining students. It's interesting in the language even because I noticed that you talk about ability, and sometimes recently actually in the UK when I've been talking about this, you get quite a lot of pushback. You're talking about ability because people perceive that to be fixed. And I tend to use the word high attaining more because that's kind of a current status. You're currently a high attaining student, which means anyone could move towards that group, whereas the high ability suggests something like sort of rigid in people's minds. So if I occasionally talk about high attaining students, that's the reason. But if you look at the elements of learning, attention, focus, and regulation, uh, knowledge and memory, retention, recall, mastery, and application. I mean, all of those things apply to everybody, don't they? So when we're thinking through this presentation and all the other ones in your conference, I don't think it's helpful to sort of hive off high attaining students and say they've got sort of additional problems, or it's just about the level of attainment they're at and the need that the fact they need to continue to strive for excellence from where they already are. But I don't think you sort of enter a category of where the way that you think and learn is fundamentally different. It's just that you already know more and you can therefore solve harder questions and so on. That's my view. So any time where you sort of start saying you need to have a totally special approach for certain groups of students, I think it's very difficult from a professional point of view, um, especially when you're trying to be inclusive at the same time. And it's the same with the elements of teaching. There's nothing on there where you think, oh, we're going to need something extra for the high attainers. Uh, it's all about the sequence of it and the particular curriculum choices that you're making. That's my view of it. So we can take stock of that, and I do think it's useful to do that from time to time to think, what's the role of, for example, explicit teaching for high attaining students? Well, it's strong, but they can also do things more independently. And when we get to the whole idea of independent practice, you can expect students who already got a lot of knowledge to do more things independently. And I think that's something we should look at. And actually, sometimes that's the issue in lessons, that the students could have done more by themselves if you let them. And by the end of the session, I'm going to sort of be sharing you some ideas for how you can really develop agency for high attainers by letting them have quite a lot of input into the learning process, even albeit in an instructional manner, as hopefully will come clear. So linked to the agenda of the teaching is the kind of the professional learning agenda. And I think, I've been asked to sort of touch on this briefly, but one of the things I think is brilliant about the profession these days is that we're starting to understand that sort of top-down, judgmental, hierarchical, high accountability systems are wrong. Just they don't work, they don't motivate teachers, they make teachers want to leave teaching, and they don't actually make them any better. So, we've been through a whole process in the UK for sure of people being trained as leaders to judge teachers, and you get sort of high status as a leader if you're able to accurately evaluate a teacher and all that kind of rubbish. But it's not really true. And the Dylan Williams data that he presented at a Melbourne conference I was at recently, was so interesting how if you teach a high attaining class, say in a set math sets, say the top 20% rather than the bottom 20% set, you're 6 times more likely to be given the highest grade. If I go to this picture here, you're 6 times more likely to be given the highest grade if you're teaching the higher attaining students than the bottom 20%. Because the students are manifest sort of, it's not true. And so one of the issues we have to be careful about is, and this is a hard thing to say, but it's true. If you're teaching higher attaining students, you get away with stuff. Our lectures are amazing, but they would have been absolutely murdered in a full comprehensive school without question. High attaining students, are we doing as well as we could be? Because it seems on the surface to be going better than it would be if we were teaching the lower attainers. And that's just borne out in the data. That's what happens. It's not just me saying that. Luckily, we don't have to worry about that so much these days because we have this much stronger sense of professional cultures which are fostering across the world, I think, learning. And the work I do primarily is to support schools to use tools like the Walkthrus toolkit that I've made or books or various research sources. They will agree a common language. Um, let's look at some codification of ideas so that we have a common understanding of what things mean, and then we can evaluate how well we're doing them. And there's tons of stuff in that which applies to high attainers. And then you need processes which allow people to involve themselves in an iterative cycles of improvement. So all the schools I go to where this is working well, you have regular meetings built into the timetable, or not necessarily in the day, but in the week. So it could be after school, but it's sort of not discretionary time. It's time which is your professional time that you're supposed to use, and it's dedicated to this process of reflection and deciding on an agenda. And then on a cycle of sort of say 2 to 4 weeks is what we always say is the optimum. Sort of between 2 and 4 weeks later, you're going to come back together again and reflect on how it went. And ideally, you're not relying on self-report. You're not relying on how did it go. You're relying on, well, I watched your lesson, or I watched your video, or you two observed each other, or there's some reality check process. And there are lots of ways of doing that, aren't there, by video or observation or whatever. But the important part is that when you meet to discuss things, that you've got a shared kind of knowledge of what the lessons were like and observe what it's like to be in someone else's lesson. So, for example, when you sit at the back of the class and listen to children have a discussion in what the teachers call a turn and talk or a think, pair, share, and you listen to what they actually say, is it what are they actually saying? Is it high? Is it excellent? And often it's just not at all excellent. It's absolutely terrible. It's just shallow. So in a context of high attaining students, coaching and feedback processes, I think, are really helpful. You just listen to a couple of children who ought to be able to, when they're not, because the question was too shallow or not. It's a really good discussion to have. Like even though you thought it wasn't demanding, or it was too demanding, or it didn't allow them all to express themselves, or not everybody had a turn. And there's all sorts of detail in there. And I find these sort of conversations are the best ones to have. It was mentioned earlier, Mind the Gap. My most recent interview there was with a head teacher of a school in the UK, which is one of the best schools I've been to. It was a primary school. And there the teachers are, she said she'd appointed her first new teacher last year for 7 years. So all her teachers have been there at least 7 years, apart from one. And they're very mature, experienced teachers. And you might think, well, in that case, what do they have to discuss? Because they must be so good. But actually, good because they constantly can about all the details of their craft. Which question? They obsess about the detail of how lessons are structured and how to evolve all of them and what excellence would look like and how children would know. And it's the fact that they are constantly evaluating without fear of judgment, just because it's interesting and necessary as professionals to engage in that depth. So for me, it's a brilliant example of how PD and professional learning isn't for people who are struggling. It's for all of us. It's for people who are genuinely excellent. And uh, I think it's something to think about. My video's gone off. Is that on purpose or should I put it back on again? I don't really know. Um, I'll turn it off if that's the reason. So part of that is a framework, and I'm not going to go into this in any great detail, but there is a kind of framework for thinking about lesson observations. And I think that when you think about the lens of high attainers, when you go in to watch somebody's lesson, this is just a framework that I wrote a while ago, but just broadly, is the teacher explaining and modeling? Is that the phase of the lesson? Are they sort of running the room and asking questions to and fro? Or are the students practicing doing things? And what does the teacher do at that point? So I feel like that's a kind of, those are three broad areas. And then within that, when you observe multiple teachers in a school, what you often think is it's nothing to do with the teachers. It's the curriculum. Is it the curriculum that's holding things back or accelerating? You almost always see common issues from one lesson to another, which are therefore discussed that is with everybody, not just one to one. Common pedagogical issues, like you're in an English department, or you're watching a load of maths lessons or a load of year two teachers, and you realize that everyone has this challenge in this context. So again, the best place to discuss that is with everybody. Sometimes you see issues with individual teachers within that team, but I would say it's less often than the other things. So it's important to understand the collective power of yeah, because we have more in common than we like to them doing their own thing. And talking about high attaining students and how we make the best of them, and making a focus of this type of process, but looking for, because that's going to be more likely to lead to positive change. Okay, so I mean, with that that's a bit of preamble. I think the professional learning process you're in is important. So, for example, what's the point of you sitting here listening to me talking if you don't do anything with it? I mean, you might just say, well, they didn't learn anything from me, which might be fair, but just broadly across the whole conference, you have to have a system which says we have to take ideas and put them into practice. Because if, as the result of a process like this, you teach exactly the same, you haven't really changed your practice. And I think that's something everyone needs to be conscious of. You've got to be taking ideas and thinking, how do I use that? And what specific thing am I going to do differently when I teach my class? So if you teach your class the same as you always did, you haven't really moved on. So from all of this, you have to be quite specific and say, well, what things could I do differently? What things could I do differently? And isolating specific actions that you take, or specific choices you make, or specific resources you use, specific questions you ask is what it comes down to. It's not, it has to be as sharp as that. Otherwise, it's too nebulous. And you have this sense that you'd like to be a good teacher for the high attaining students. But what exactly are you going to do? I think that's such an important question. So I'm going to frame this for the rest of this about in three areas, because I think there are broadly three areas where this works. And I'm going to refer to a model which I use in my book, The Learning Rainforest. And that's a book I wrote in 2017. I was trying to capture quite a lot of specific ideas and reconcile kind of instructional teaching with um, my belief and my experience that there's more to teaching than only instructional teaching. especially where students have got high levels of agency already and lots of prior knowledge. So I came up with this idea that the trees represent the students. I mean, it's not the most original idea, but they're growing. So they're growing. And how do things grow? Well, you need the conditions for them to grow in need to be rich and fertile. Trees in a rainforest grow trunks with branches, which is a kind of structure to hold up the canopy. And a canopy represents kind of excellence. It represents all the possibilities, the things you can do. But my message here is that you can't just jump. You can't just jump to the possibilities. You can't just say, let's do all the groovy, cool stuff, unless the students have got the knowledge to do that with. And you won't build the knowledge if you don't have the right conditions. So it sort of all of it builds on one on the other. But you sort of work on them in parallel, but you have to be really clear that without good knowledge, some of the enrichment activities that often get pushed onto students just don't work very well. And I'll explore some of those. So the first thing, if I just start off with this, the conditions. I think this is important, and one of the obvious things is this thing about high expectations. High expectations is a very nebulous idea, but you just have to be really aware of this. Like if you go and see, say, 5 teachers in a typical school, all teaching science, say, there's no question that some teachers have higher expectations than others. They just do. But each one of those teachers would think that you meant them. That's the problem. Like, are you one of the people that has high expectations or not? And no one wants to say no to that. And yet it really is an important variable. So and how does that manifest itself? Well, it manifests itself in things like being bothered about things like whether the students give extended verbal answers, whether they're on time, even things like that, whether they write properly and write, in proper grammar and sentences, or whether they can link one idea to another without prompting and give reasons for their maths answers and so on, all sorts of things. And you go to some lessons where the teacher just doesn't expect that. They just expect the most shallow answer perpetually, and the teacher next door always follows up with probing questions. So I feel like, and also it could be things like the volume of homework. And when I first worked in a selective school back in 2008, the thing that impressed me the most was how the teachers had absolutely no qualms about making the children work incredibly hard. Now, if you're a maths teacher, there was nothing wrong with telling the kids an hour of homework to do for tomorrow, because there was math, we had to get on with it and go and practice and do it by tomorrow. And that was normal. That wasn't like controversial. All the parents expected it, the kids expected it, and teachers expected it, and it happened. And the students would do, 10 hours of homework a week easily, week in, week out. And that was just their normal. And my son went to a school a bit like that, and he had the same. Um, his first day of our year 12, so the beginning of our final 2 years, first day of school in the sixth form, as we call it, he got given 3 hours of maths practice to do over the weekend, and he just got on with it. He just sat down and did a ton of algebra. And it was like that type of thing is a culture which forms where it's just normal. It's not like no one's there going, oh God, what? 3 hours of maths homework. It's like, I get it. I've started this new course. I want to do really well. You want to find out whether I've remembered everything from the last year. So you're giving me a ton of homework to see. And that's the deal. And we kind of have this understanding that high expectations mean hard work, and it becomes the water you swim in. And that's what it was like in that school when I was the principal, that the students just expected it to be difficult and in terms of effort. And I think that's something you can't, it's hard to engineer from nothing, but it's definitely a factor. Schools where children excel work hard. There's no softening that. So you have to create working hard as a peer norm. It's difficult if most of the children don't work hard and some of them do. So you've got to kind of normalize working hard. And that means you've got to talk about it all the time and definitely expect it. And as soon as the teacher says, oh gosh, this homework's a bit hard, or you don't have to do it, we lose that. So one of the things that we have in our walkthroughs is a thing called pitch it up. And there are a few things on here like depth before speed. When I'm not a big fan of acceleration because I think that often leads to shallowness and motivates getting to the end quickly. I think depth is more important, especially if you're trying to also balance inclusion. But this next one is much more actionable. Expect sophistication, accuracy, and precision. So if, as a teacher, if you can pride yourself on being someone who says, say, use the proper terminology. If the line should go through 7.3 on the graph, don't put it through 7.4 because it's wrong. It's supposed to be there, so do it properly and that type of thing. And that type of precision, like with accents in languages. Now, some languages teachers literally have no expectations of children saying things in a proper accent, and they speak French in England in this horrible English accent because the teachers never expected them to say it in a French accent. And other lessons you go to, and it's explicitly part of the learning that when you speak French, you do it in a French accent because that's how French people speak. And it's like whether you want to, you have to decide whether you're bothered or not. So I think these things are really interesting discussions to have as a team. Eliminate mediocrity. So for me, there are some absolute no-nos, like there's no excuse for a word search in a school, for example, I would say. I mean, they're always just filler. Or a group task where there's five people making a poster and one of the children is relegated to sort of bubble writing duty doing the title. I mean, that's just unforgivable. I mean, I think you're basically writing that child off and saying, I don't really care if you learn about this because you're going to do the title and bubble writing. It's things like that. You just get rid of all the rubbish because there's plenty of rubbish that kids are asked to do and so on. So pitch it up is a concept we can all explore. But lurking in there, this is the main thing I want to mention in this section. Select the more demanding curriculum options. You've got to get into that. And I'm going to do a quick run through on this. So for example, here's a curriculum, a Key Stage 3 curriculum of a school in the UK where, in our year 7, 8, and 9, so it's like, 6, 7, and 8, the children will read the Iliad, bits of the Iliad. They'll encounter Beowulf. They'll read James Joyce alongside more classic things like Lord of the Flies, Othello, and The Hobbit. It's rich, it's engaging, it's interesting, it's challenging inherently. And so there's no question there that there's soft text being peddled to placate the children and engage them in a soft way. It's fundamentally interesting and challenging and full of story and drama, and it's exciting. So those are positive, high challenge curriculum choices. Another thing might be the resources used for primary, upper primary. There's some superb resources with a group called Opening Worlds, really rich texts and resources. Well, this is like for kids who are 8 or 9 years old, learning about the Indus Valley, for example. And the resources are really rich, and you've got them learning about what sources are in a really detailed way. It's sort of these are resources produced by expert historians, Steve Maston and Christine Council. In a secondary school where you ask them what their year 7 curriculum is, this is one of my favourite ones. The overall topic for year 7 is how did empires, trade, migration, and belief link Britain to the world, a million BC to 1492? It's this like lovely idea that we're giving them a huge sweep of history. We're gonna sort of go way back, like before there were humans, and talk about how we ended up here. And it's like this broad view. All these things are curriculum choices. There's a primary set of primary schools where they do reading like this. So the texts are rich. They read about the Anglo-Saxons. They don't just get PowerPoints. In the text, there's tasks, there's keywords. These are children who are 9, and they're reading about, in this high level. It's pitched high, but it's structured, it's scaffolded, and there's a lot of reading. And very generally, I think reading is something which you really have to do. The higher up the school goes, what is wrong with saying to a class of children, here's a book, read chapter 1, and we're going to discuss it next lesson. Like, they should be able to do that. If you've taught them to read, they're reading for a purpose, and one of the purposes is to read books, factual knowledge books, and then they develop agency. And of course, some of them won't do it initially, so you have to really have some accountability to that, because they have to show you that they've read it. But in the lesson relies on them having read it, and that's a high stakes thing. And if they haven't done it, you're not happy with them, and you let them know that, and you set up a culture where when I ask you to read something, I expect it to be done, and you're going to find out that that's not going to be comfortable if you don't, and you create this norm. So it becomes the norm over time that reading is part of learning, and we can do that independently. And I think that has become more and more rare. And if you have to provide the text so you control what they read and make sure that it's reference to those specific texts. So it's not about just go and find out on the internet. It's read this. Other curriculum choices, like for example, if you understand the curriculum, you weave stories. So it always pains me, whether it's in primary or secondary, when teachers say something like rocks are boring. And every time anyone who says rocks are boring basically doesn't understand them. Because the reason rocks are fascinating is, apart from the changes that they go through, but they're like a clock of the world. Because of the rocks, we know how old the Earth is, and we can explain dinosaurs. And all kids see dinosaurs in a museum or in a toy shop. But what are they, and how do they get there? Well, to understand that dinosaurs evolved and then became extinct before humans evolved is an incredible thing, and the size of them and everything. But the rocks unlock that story, and we can see through the layers of rocks the different fossils, and we learn about evolution from that. And it ties in with the curriculum when we talk about evolution and how we're forming the schema for living things, and the fact that living things are all related, going back through, and we know that through DNA and through the fossil record and through sort of just the structure of bodies and so on. And fantastic stories like hippos are more closely related to whales than they are to cows, which seems improbable, but we know that from the evidence of the DNA of those organisms. And how does that even happen? How can a hippo be more closely related to a whale and dolphin than a cow? Well, you have to talk about the story, and you can get kids interested in all of that. And we understand about this because the time scale that allows that to be true is told by the story of rocks. So when you're teaching rocks, you're basically teaching the kids about time and the age of the earth and how it's actually such an extraordinarily long time that has allowed us to become alive on the planet. And I think that's one of the most profound stories you can tell. And if you don't know that's the story, you won't tell it. So knowing the story that's lurking in your curriculum, I think is absolutely essential. That's a curriculum discussion. So when you've got a unit of work as a team of teachers and you're saying, what story are we telling through this curriculum? Well, once you know it's a story as exciting as this one, you're going to do it better. And you share questions, you share resources, you share all ideas about it. And one final example on the curriculum, well, there's a few examples. One of them is like how pitched up it is. So I often share this because it's just an important thing. Here was my son's first science homework when he went to secondary school. So he turned up, he was absolutely buzzing when he came home. He said it was just absolutely awesome science today. Like he didn't know, man, that's just like invented atoms. And I just said, what do you mean? He said, well, yeah, this was a man called Democritus. We learned all about him. And he was playing with sand and water, and he decided that maybe water behaves a bit like sand. So maybe it's made up of little grains like sand is. And he called them atoma. And it's actually true that my son went on to study philosophy at university. I'm not saying the seed was sown here, that would be stretching it, but he did. But this was literally his first homework question when he went to secondary school. What is the difference between science and philosophy? And that was his homework. I, I went to my school and I asked my guys, okay, what do we set in science as the first homework? And they said, oh, we get them to do a cover page illustrating the lab safety rules. I just thought, oh God, no longer we're in so much trouble. Like basically we're patronizing our year 11, our 11-year-olds because there they are coloring in their goggles and their apron or whatever, the heat-proof mat. And my son is talking about the difference between science and philosophy a couple of miles away. It's like, that's the difference. And it's all about understanding how do I set the scene for talking about solids, liquids, and gases? Well, I know what the curriculum is. I know what it's all about curriculum really when it comes down to it. There's loads of examples more I could give. Another one I think is really important is how hands-on the curriculum is. So it's one of my claims, one of my kind of campaigns, which I'm not very good at pursuing, but every child should grow a bean. That's I think I believe. What? Because it's real. It's actually happens. You can track it, and it shows you the world is much more complicated than any diagram. So it's inherently frustrating. Some of the beans will die, and you can see why. And some of them get bigger than others, even though they're in the same place on the shelf, or they seem like it. And so there's so many variables there to look at, and it's just really important and interesting to see for kids to track something over time. So some learning doesn't happen in an instant of a lesson; it happens over sequence. And there's a lad who is looking at the insects that he's collected in his little pooter, a handmade pooter, where you go out to the field and suck up bugs into the jar and look at real insects. And looking at real insects is way more interesting and also challenging than looking at a diagram of it. And you see the world as real and complicated and something that needs to be studied. And I feel like that's often bypassed. I mean, some of you will do that automatically, but it's not absolutely universal. So very generally, this idea of the curriculum being, the teachers have so much scope, and high expectations are about things like that. And I'll give you a last curriculum example, another science example here. So the picture on the left is of an electric motor. Now, when you're a physics teacher and you have the discussion about the scheme of work, I've been in this meeting where the teachers say, "Oh, we used to get them to make motors, but to be honest with you, it's pretty fiddly and it takes a while, and we haven't got much time, so we've cut that out now. We just sort of like look at this simulation on the screen." And I just think, why? Why is it better to look at a simulation which you can control as the teacher, rather than get every kid in the class to make a motor? That the science, the groundwork you're doing, like for example, you start with the magnets. The kids can feel magnetism. They can feel that one magnet repels another. They can feel the force between the magnets, and they can see, you can point at it and say, "Isn't it amazing that those two objects, one of them pushes the other away, but they're not in contact. How does that work?" And just them to sort of perceive this is a property of the universe that we're in. It's just like contemplate it, just feel it, experience it, because then that's a feeling. And then of course, when they're attracting, these two things move towards each other. How does one magnet know the other one's there? It's just all these things are questions, right? And then obviously to wrap a coil of wire around a block of wood and then strip the ends off, so you make a circuit as it rotates. You put that coil of wire in between the magnets, and it spins around like crazy. It's not a trivial thing. That is a wonder of the world right there. It's right in their hands. They're seeing this incredible phenomenon, and they can make it themselves, and it's very profound, strong, and it's to do with the properties of the universe that it happens, that magnetism and electricity, which seemingly are very different things, interact, and then you can get them to predict which way it will move and all that kind of stuff. So it's deciding that is the curriculum is a choice. If you want to challenge high attainers, you've got to get them to see the world as it is, and get them to sort of see the challenge we have of trying to explain things. And of course, the Hubble, I sort of stubbornly keep that photo rather than updating it to the James Webb, which is obviously way better. But the fact of our existence on Earth in a universe full of galaxies, and there's 10,000 galaxies in those. Those aren't stars; those are galaxies in a tiny patch of sky. And these are mind-blowing ideas that we're in this huge empty space, and we're looking back in time at the light that's arriving from distant galaxies. This is profound stuff, right? So when you're talking about the universe and the solar system and the stars, this is profound. This is about our place on Earth. This is about our existence. It's existential, and you have the opportunity to pitch that to kids, or not. You can just make it very prosaic and functional, and now copy the diagram in your book. So that's my first pitch to you. Like when you're looking at the curriculum, elements of learning what is the key. And the what, the content of all of that is essential. Knowledge and memory of what, retention of what matters that they should know. And these are choices which, you have to, is the absolute fundamentals. And then when we come into teaching, of course, a lot of that needs explicit teaching. And you can't guess your way to understanding um, solids, liquids, and gases. You have to be taught. That's a strongly instructional thing, but it's linked to experience. So it's how do we weave in experience of holding things, touching things, controlling things with the a very conceptual model of molecules. We have to link up where our explicit teaching is not removed from highly interactive things built on concrete experience. So we have to have experiential learning is not separate from instructional teaching. This is one of the key things I think we need to be clear about. So just checking the time there. The conditions are important, and I think I spend a lot of time on that because I feel that often gets bypassed. Like you can't just talk about, like Rosenshine's principles until you've talked about what you're trying to teach. But of course, then we do have to get into that. When you have a look at this memory model and how the reasons why children don't learn, that could apply at any level. So look, the lack of prior knowledge could be to go to the highest level of excellence, of depth. So you've got to build knowledge constantly. You can't just zap to the highest standard. You've got to build, 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 build. But things like fluency, memory overload, these still apply. But of course, the more that you know, the more you can rely on your fluency. So you can actually cope with more information. So these things are mutually reinforcing if you get them right. If you swap those around, strong attention, secure prior knowledge, building lots of fluency, then we can deal with more on our working memory. And we avoid this thing of task completion being a poor proxy because we design good tasks which are inherently challenging. So the challenge for teachers is to flip all those into good things rather than problems. And that links to Dan Willingham's Why Don't Students Like Schools? So to summarize his fantastic work, memory is the residue of thought. Everyone needs to be thinking. And often one of the things that teachers need to decide to do is get kids to do stuff by themselves rather than in groups and pairs, because often what happens is you've got this offloading of effort to somebody else and the illusion of collaboration, but it's not really being collaborative. What happened was that kid did all the work and that one just sat there and copied the answers down, and that happens a lot. So maximizing thinking for everyone is essential. And then it's the depth of thinking. And using stories is important. And as Willingham says, deep knowledge is always the goal. So don't pitch for a shallow thing, pitch deep. And of course, some shallow knowledge will come through, and I'll explain that in a minute. The last sort of theoretical idea in this that I think is relevant is the ideas of Ausubel, who talks about meaningful learning, and Sarah Cottingett's book on this is absolutely brilliant. And Ausubel highlights this idea that when you're teaching a class of children, they are all making meaning in their own head, and you have to engage with that, or else you don't know what to teach them next. So when you've taught something exciting and fascinating, like how beans grow, or what the whole extreme deep field means, or the story of evolution, or whatever, to use a load of science examples, or you might have gone to a show or an art gallery or whatever. These are all images of children doing things. What meaning has been made by each child? We don't know unless you find out. You've got to engage with them. So we have to have this process of teaching where we're thinking constantly. Is everybody thinking is the bedrock? But then is everyone making sense of this? And what sense have they made? And I have to give them time to make sense for themselves. And they have to practice. And even very high attaining students need to practice. And so let me give an example of a flow of a lesson where you might pitch this up. So let me say, how might you teach this? This is my current go-to example. How do I make sure that everyone understands pollination of bees. Well, I'm going to hopefully go outside and see some bees for real around some real flowers. But if I can't, I'm at least going to show them a video and a real photo of it or something. So we've got this idea of bees and real flowers being coloured. And I do this in my training. I haven't got time to do it with you or the opportunity, but I would run this with a group of teachers. We do a thing which is called queuing for attention. So I'm going to say, in a minute, you're going to have to explain this on your own to your partner, and everyone's going to be doing that. So you're all going to do it in your pairs, and so everyone's going to do this without any labels. So I'm going to do it for you first, and then you're going to practice with the labels. So everyone knows that eventually they're going to have to do it on their own, and it could be then that I ask to run through it in front of the class. So I explain this. I tell the story, we practice the vocabulary, we get everyone to chorally say stamen and anther, and we talk about the male and the female parts and how this is a product of natural selection. That's why, bees are still alive and so are these flowers, because this has worked out well for both of them. And we tell the story in a narrative form. So we're not just saying, what's this bit, what's that bit, like isolated knowledge. We're going for deep knowledge, which is the role of bees in supporting the propagation of these flowers through transferring pollen. Then, this is a key bit, the children then practice explaining it back to each other in pairs. They rehearse the story that I've told them. And guess what? When you sample the room and ask a couple of children, they never tell you exactly the same story you've told, because the way they've made sense of it varies. And you pick up nuances between the different versions, and then you correct a few things and reinforce a few things. And then you see if they can do it without the help. You take the scaffolding down, and the children see if they can learn it. And that type of self-test is important because the children then get a sense of their own knowledge. So one of the big things about learner agency is then knowledge yourself. Do you understand how bees support the pollination? Well, I don't know, because every time I look at that diagram that I've copied in my book, I recognize it and it looks familiar. I only know if I know it by testing myself to see if I can tell the story and maybe ask some subsequent questions. So that's the flow. You have got to get children to become aware of their own knowledge by testing them and learning that testing is a normal part of a flow. If you map that up against Rosenshine's principles, you'll find all the elements in there. But it's applying it to that specific context. So when you're teaching pollination, the way you teach it, the end product isn't a lovely labeled diagram in your book, which has bypassed all the thinking. The outcome is children who can explain it to each other really well. That's what you want, because they understand it and they can tell you the story. So the fact that they can tell the story means they've understood it, because it's too complicated to learn it verbatim, and you wouldn't want them to anyway. So this is what you need to be thinking, pedagogically speaking, when you've got teaching techniques. It's all about which questions are applied to which curriculum and how we layer it up to build a high success rate. And of course, everyone benefits from a high success rate, and we can take the scaffolding down quicker than for others. So linked to that, in our Walkthrus toolkit, we have techniques like process questions, probing questions, say it again better. These are all techniques which go further after that initial probe. So one of the things with questioning is knowing the depth. Now, here's one of my favorite questions to illustrate this, because you can ask this question to kids who are 7, 11, 14, 18. Why does your heart beat faster during exercise? And 7-year-olds can give you a really good answer about energy and needing food and being out of breath and all this kind of stuff. They know, they can describe it at a certain level. In year 11, sorry, at age 11, they can start talking about oxygen and carbon dioxide, because they've learnt a bit about that. When they're 14, they should know what respiration is and use the equation, and so on and so on. So when you're teaching, you've got to know the pitch. You've got to know, what am I aiming for? And then when you're probing the students' questioning, you're explicitly trying to get them to up-level their answer. Linked to that is this idea of process questions. So, for example, in this maths question, this is a question which, on a sort of national test in the UK, a lot of children did badly on. because it seems easy, but they don't know where to start. And that's the problem. All the arithmetic is easy, like 12 divided by 2, 30 divided by 6. But why are those the answers? And also 90 divided by. So in a question like this, the challenge isn't it's understanding how to apply that simple arithmetic to a problem. So the key word in here is identical. It unlocks the question. So of course, without knowing what that means, literally mathematically identical means identical in every way, the same lengths and so on. So 12, it covers two sides the same, so that's going to be 6 each and so on. 90 covers 3 areas, identical areas, so 90 divided by 3 is 30. So 30 divided by 6 is 5. The answer is 5. But if a child gives you the answer 5, in a typical classroom, you've got to question and think, well, how did they know that was 5? Did they just notice someone else had put 5, or can they explain it? And reasoning and so on is an important part of understanding maths. The answer doesn't always tell us they understood it. So process questions generally, like, what is 7 cubed? Someone might know it's 343, but how do they work it out is an interesting question, or how do they know? What is the main cause of global warming in a geography lesson? Someone might know to say burning fossil fuels, for example. But why? I can correct the spelling on my thing here. Why is that the main cause? What's the information? It might be about looking at some data and so on. So asking students to justify their answers, all this sort of thing, is part of the flow of a lesson. I'll give you an example. I'll just give you one example of, because there's so many other things I want to say about this, but let me give you an example of a good version, bad version of a lesson I saw, which is, in the last year or so. I use this in my training all the time because it was such a classic example. There's an art lesson. And art, obviously the challenge in art when you're in a normal art curriculum is about creating things, composition and so on. But actually in this context, it was about understanding the meaning of art. And I saw this lesson taught twice by 2 different teachers on the same day. And one of the teachers had, I'd say, a kind of fairly shallow understanding of the scheme of work. I think she'd read it in a hurry and didn't really do it very well. So she basically said, here's some graffiti on a train. So guys, what do you think? Is it art? Have a think, have a chat on your tables. And that's kind of what she said, was literally have a chat on your tables. And the boys in front of me were just sort of saying, I don't know, I don't think it's art. And the other one went, no, I think it's vandalism. And the other went, no, I think it's art. Well, I think it's vandalism. And they kind of just went to and fro. They didn't really know how to answer that. And they had, and it was obvious that the teacher hadn't modelled any depth, any rigor. Now, the next teacher I saw did it. She did it thoroughly. So what she did is, for a start, she wasn't trying to say, is it art or vandalism? Like in terms of pick a side, she was modeling this approach where you say, well, on one hand, it could be considered art, but on the other hand, it could be thought of as vandalism. So she made the children explore the 2 opposing arguments and then to see if they could reconcile them. So that's much more demanding. Now, we're not just picking a team, we're exploring the context. And she also wanted them to refer to some of the key concepts in the curriculum: aesthetics, whether the art has explicit meaning, the concept of genre, ideas about rights and consent in relation to public art. And so when the students were then in their pair, they had 2 sets of things to refer to. One of them is these key words and concepts, and the other one was the framework on one hand, but on the other hand. And the outcomes were just massively, massively stronger from the same parallel type of class, another year 9 class. So you've got the same scheme of work taught differently by 2 different teachers, because one of them had gone for this much more structured, scaffolded approach. And the scaffolding for depth, sometimes people think is a contradiction. Now, you might think a high attaining lesson would be, let's just deepend it. Let's just say, well, they should be clever enough, smart enough to do this by themselves. But no, they won't. I mean, children just don't suddenly learn how to say, on the one hand, but on the other hand, it has to be modelled. You know, your average 13-year-old does not go around the playground saying, well, on the one hand, I think that the school lunches have a rather limited range of options. But on the other hand, when you do get some food, it's rather delicious. You know, they don't talk that way. They they need to be shown how to express these ideas, and then they can use them. So this is a much deeper, richer lesson because it was scaffolded, not because it wasn't. And that's something which sometimes I think gets misunderstood. So the best work in that class, the children will talk about aesthetic value of the Banksy, the genre of stencil art, and the rights of, you know, it was just amazing. And she could structure the discussion, and I could go into the pedagogy of the lesson as well. Like a class discussion starts in silence. Why? Because everyone has to have a chance to think, not just the kids who are going to dominate the class. So we start in silence, then we share with our pair. Everyone's therefore talking. So literally every child talks. Then you cold call because then you select some of the answers. And then you say, well, let's have some hands up. Hands up if you like to agree with this. Hands up if you like to disagree with that. Hands up if you've got a different perspective. So you can control the hands up, adding, building, and challenging. And you summarize the argument as it develops so that the weakest children in the class can follow it and store it. So there's a structure, a discipline to a class discussion. And I've seen teachers who think, oh, I've got a top class. I'll just sit on the desk with my legs crossed and sort of wing it, like it's a university tutorial with 3 children. And it's wrong. You know, higher tailing students need structure to make sure they're all able to participate alongside their colleagues who are perhaps less naturally articulate. And that's important. Everyone needs a place. No child in the class matters less than anybody else. So if you're having a class discussion about something really interesting like this, who has to participate? Everyone does. So this is universality is such an important idea. So that's the final thing I want to say about that in terms of the knowledge structure. You've got to involve everybody. So you have to scaffold for that, but scaffolding benefits everyone if you scaffold well. And your questioning pedagogy has to have this probing aspect to it. And at all points, you're trying to give every child a chance to make meaning rather than just parrot things or kind of remember stuff off by heart. The last section, in my last 10 minutes, exploring the possibilities. I mean, I could talk about this at length, but once you have students with deep knowledge, you can really challenge them. And sometimes it's really interesting to work out whether it's you holding them back or them, because often it's the teachers. When I do a lot of this work, sometimes it's the teacher's belief. They just think, oh, well, my kids can't do that. And I just say, well, no, I don't think they can because you just told me that because you don't prepare to give it a go. So I'll give you a few examples. One of them is linked to oracy and speaking. So this is a fairly classic thing, but in this was my school 10 years ago. All the children in year 8 gave a speech. We had 200 kids in the year. That was 197 speeches over 2 days because we thought it was important that everyone had that opportunity, not just the kids who come up in assembly and get the stars. And every child had that challenge. It was a big challenge to stand in front of like 60 people. Their parents invited. This was the rehearsal photos where they had, most of them did it with no notes at all. Some of them had bullet points, but they had to give a speech about something they cared about. So they prepared it, they'd written it, then they'd learnt it, and they had to then deliver it. So it was part of this sort of formal type of speaking. So oracy obviously is bigger than this, but it was definitely challenging and very powerful. I mean, some of the speeches are just, we were all just crying at the back all day because they were so affecting. It was unbelievable. It was one of the most emotional 2 days I've ever had in a school. Here's a more structured thing. This is like an endpoint assessment from the international primary curriculum, where an assessment at the end of a unit is verbal. Like they give a presentation, and people are invited in their various stands. And I saw a school doing this one about the Romans and Roman roads. And I swear to God, this boy who was 10, He was like the world's expert on how Romans built roads. It was just amazing. He could just tell you about it. He had no notes. He had made a model road. He'd learned all about it, and he just knew it, right? So his assessment was doing that. And he had like a whole morning telling us all as we walked around to all these different stalls. It's absolutely superb. What a great way to demonstrate knowledge. Um, and it was very engaging, as well as developing those skills. Now, I used to do this in my own teaching, so there's some pictures of my own lessons. As a physics teacher, who did all the demonstrations? The students did, because they could. And once I realized they could, and they could do it really well, I could just hold them to account for it. So those two boys were given 3 weeks' notice as part of my forces team. You're going to explain the ticker tape timer, a classic bit of traditional physics apparatus. They did a great lesson. They demonstrated it. They showed how it worked. They set up the students to do their own class practical. They had to do a worksheet. They had to set a homework task with questions. That was the whole deal. That you plan a lesson in full. Here's a boy called Daniel, who, this is when he was in year 9, explaining electron configuration to the class. He explained how it worked. He then got them all drawing the shells of the electrons and making sure they could all draw the first 20 elements and so on. He ran that lesson because he could, and so I asked him to. Here are some students in a year 13. This is actually from someone else's blog. I found they did the same thing. One of the best lessons I've ever seen. The students were asked to read Dr. Faustus over the holidays, and when they came in, the teacher said, "Okay, well, you know what I've asked you to do was to present your reading of Dr. Faustus through a timeline," and they'd all prepared that. So they came in groups, took it in turns to explain their timeline of sort of good versus evil, uh, and therefore sort of showing their understanding of the messages and the themes in the play that they'd read. It was absolutely incredible. The teacher didn't have to explain anything about the play because they'd read it and could understand it, and then showed their knowledge. And she was then sort of teasing out certain things and going to nuance. But the lessons started with the students for this, so they could do it because they're already highly sophisticated learners. The thing in a more instructional way on previous texts. My son had this experience when he was in year 5. Every kid taught a new skill. So when he was in year 5, they had class guitars, and some of you recognize that straight away as Smoke on the Water. So Sam, he taught his class how to play Smoke on the Water. And he had to learn that the whole point was you had to break it down into skills, into steps, write out the steps and plan a script. So this is one of the things he'd worked on. Now every kid did that, and over the year, so this is a long game. Every week, one of the kids taught the class a new skill. So a lot of kids picked guitar songs. Some of them chose languages that they could teach a bit of, or things like juggling and origami, that type of stuff. But it was brilliant. It was a great experience for him to stand in front of a group of children, his peers, and stand up and talk to them. So this type of thing is what I call exploring the possibilities. But it's not a lesson, it's a program. And the last couple of things, sometimes you have to give kids a chance to have free choice. So one of the things we used to do is go to a free museum. So I've been privileged to be in 2 schools where the British Museum was within reach. So you could say to the parents and the children, you need to go to the British Museum in sometime in the next 5 months in family time. And some of the parents would say to me, "Are you making me go to the British Museum?" And I would say, "Yes, I am." And they always were really grateful. So like it's like a family learning project, we called it. And then, but the thing was, go to the British Museum and do a project, like pick something and write about it, or do whatever you want. The kids would make artifacts. Some of them would a lot of written pieces, some journals with photos, and this was the whole combination: a box with a sarcophagus in it and a scroll. This was the Book of the Dead, beautiful thing. This was like an inch thick, full of examples. My favorite one though was when I used to teach RE. Um, it always sounds a bit naff to say for my sins I used to teach RE, but it's true. We had students who what we did was to summarize, it was our sort of way of doing things. At the end of the unit, you would summarize what you've learned, and we would say, do it in any way that you'd like. In fact, I think if I move this photo out of the way, you can see that's the beginning, and this is like one of the pages. So inside this website, these boys who are 11 years old they said to me, can we make a website? And I thought it would be terrible, but this is what they made. And they made a site called Embracing Islam. And it's got all these questions like misconceptions of Islam, science and Islam, the Quran, take the quiz. So the materials all had to have prompts for their colleagues. It was superb. The next term we did Christianity, and the same students from the award-winning creators of Embracing Islam, welcome to our second site. They made this epic website, and there's a tab there called Comparison with Islam. So they laid out Christianity versus Islam. And I didn't ask them to do that. They did that because they wanted to, and because they could, and because the culture was dazzle me. That's what this slide says, dazzle me. Do something amazing, be impressive, be excellent. And we would show them some of the things the kids had done the years before, and they would always try to outdo it. This is just absolutely superb for an 11-year-old to make a website about that. I think it's exceptional. And the opportunity was there in the lesson, in the structure. We taught them with instructional teaching, and then they had to do this choosing. Okay, the very last thing, I'm looking at the time. Sometimes it pays to involve the students in the learning process. So I've shown you some like examples of students running lessons, but this is like a structured part of how we ran the classroom. So this is going back a time. You can see the dates on there, but I think this is another exceptional thing. So this plan was made by a boy called Rad Siddiqui, and we organized the lessons for the year in the beginning of the term, and we could see there are certain topics. We divided it up. I mean, I told them what the topics were going to be, but then they got into teams, and Rad organized everyone into teams so that everyone in the class was in a team. And these are the dates of the topics. And so the lessons on here, color coded, are for those students know this is when your unit is being taught. You are my sidekick. And they were the guys who I co-constructed the lessons with all year. So that meant they planned some lessons, they taught some lessons, they did some demos, they marked the books, and it was fantastic. They loved it. Every single student had this opportunity. Start my video. Okay, I'll do that in a minute. Thanks. The last thing I'll share is this. So this is a student in a high stakes exam, who is what we used to do is at the beginning of every year we would say of every course we'd say here's the course. So we've got students who've got agency, right? We give them the textbooks and the scheme. We say this is the course you're about to do, and we're doing it together. So we would constantly refer back to it and say, where are we so far? What have we covered so far? What is still to be taught? And this is October of the year of this exam class I had, and I kept this example. We went through it a little bit in the class, and that evening, this boy called Taran emailed me, and he said, Mr. Sherrington, I think I've worked it out. Look, I've made a list of all the topics we haven't covered yet, and all the lessons we have, and if we do it like this, I think we'll get to the end okay. And he set up this whole sort of like spreadsheet, and we followed that plan because it was good, and he understood it. Now, I've discussed with the teachers loads of times. I think, well, none of my students could do that. And I think, well, I didn't think anyone could do it, but the opportunity was there. And Taran was so involved in understanding how a syllabus works, and he could be involved with me. So that to me is like exciting when you have students who are able to push you as well as push them and have ownership of the course. Like they know they know what running a course is. But that's part of a culture. That comes from a culture where the conditions are such that we have very high expectations. I'm explicitly making you work hard and fostering agency. We teach you really thoroughly so you really know things, you have loads of time to practice. And then I give you some space to show me what you can do with no limits. And then you get kids who push you and should surprise you. And this is the reality. You can't teach everybody the same way. Some kids in a mixed class are ready to fly. They're ready to go, and you have to let them fly because that's what they need. Other kids need you to put the safety helmet on metaphorically speaking, and take them step by step. And they're in the same room. And you have to be always aware of them. You can't teach one group like the other group because they're going to break their legs or be bored stiff. And you've got to think really hard about the specific individuals in your class and who they are. And that is a really important part of the CPD. So when we're talking about the learning problems, we're not just talking about generic problems. We're talking about my problems with my class. I've got Taran. What am I going to do? I've got Daniel. He can explain electron configuration. Well, like not everyone's got a Daniel, but if we're going for a high attainment culture, solving the problems of specific individuals is part of that, as well as the curriculum, as well as the pedagogy. And I think that's an important thing to think about. Well, I probably exceeded my time. The camera was dropping in and out. I was trying to turn it on, but it kept on being turned off somehow. So I hope that wasn't too problematic. But thank you so much for listening and enjoy the rest of your conference.
And so...
So stop my sharing.
And apologies, it was actually us, Tom, turning your camera off. Sorry, just because it was getting very laggy. So I say hello to Deepest Darkest Cornwall for me, because that is literally where I moved from in England. So I do miss it. But actually, the Wi-Fi was pretty good in Cornwall where I lived, but still, you know, bats and all sorts of things. But I hope you get a very nice sleep now, Tom, as well. But a big thank you. And definitely lots of food for thought there. I mean, even the fact that I'm just trying to think hippos are more like whales than cows, trying to get my head around that. But I think the idea of pitching it up is so important, but also that you know, the importance of scaffolding and what that does to support all students. It's not actually thinking about there's a type of scaffold that you're putting in and the frameworks. And one of the things that we do, and I know that Maria and the Deacon team who are going to talk next, when we look at strategies to supporting high ability students or high attaining students, things like group work can be really powerful, but only if you're actually setting it up in the right way, because it can be equally as powerful as it also can be disengaging. But thank you once again, Tom, and have a lovely rest of your evening. And thank you everyone, and take care. See you, Tom.
Bye-bye.